So we're here on our third instalment of the Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement District sponsored lecture series here at Dr. Johnson's house. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be introducing our speaker here today, Layla Davis. Layla Davis, some of you may know, actually has been long involved in the house. Her background is in medieval history, both her undergraduate and postgraduate studies focused on that. But she took a brave leap into the 18th century and completed an internship here in the house just before lockdown started, which resulted in the excellent satire exhibit, which you'll see in the room directly below us. If you've not had a chance to visit already, do pass through that exhibit on the way out today. Following that, we decided she was so good we wanted to recruit her and keep her, and so we employed her first as a museum assistant, and she's now our assistant curator. She's currently studying a master's in museums and cultures in Birkbeck University in her spare time. I say giggling, spare time in the evenings, and she's excelling in that, and it's a result of her research on that course that we're going to hear about widows and wealth and how to influence people and hold sway in the 18th century. So would you join me in welcoming her today?
Cool, well thank you very much, Celine, and thank you all very much for being here as well. But yeah, so today's lecture is called Widows and Wealth, How to Hold Sway in the 18th Century Country House. And it wouldn't be a lecture at Dr. Johnson's house without starting with something that Johnson says about country houses. Now, it's perhaps unsurprising that a man who says when a man's tired of London, he's tired of life, doesn't really have that much to say about the countryside. He does mention it in a couple of his Rambler articles though. Neither are particularly nice about the country house. So his first one, which he wrote in 1750, he says, "It is extremely vexatious to a man of eager and thirsty curiosity to be placed at a great distance from the fountain of intelligence," in this case London, "and not only never receive the current of report till it has satiated the greatest part of the nation, but at last to find it muddled in its course and corrupted with taints or mixtures from every channel through which it flowed." I.e., he doesn't like, waiting a month to hear about some lovely dinner he's missed or some wonderful book that's been published. Less than a year later, he gets a bit kinder about the countryside. And he says, "There is scarcely any writer who has not celebrated the happiness of rural privacy and delighted himself and his reader with the melody of birds, the whisper of groves, and the murmur of rivulets." So at this point, he's beginning to see the kind of artistic merit and source of inspiration that sometimes the countryside can provide. Now, this is the only time I'm ever going to disagree with Johnson. It says it in my contract, I'm not allowed to. But for me, I think the countryside and country houses, it's a lot more than either of these two things that Johnson's suggesting. So for the 18th century, they're very much symbols of extreme wealth and absolute extravagance. I mean, if we just think about the money that goes into the finance and the construction of them and then the curation of them as well. Hester Thrale, she built Bryn Bella in Wales, which was more of a country villa, but that still cost her £20,000 to build. So if we're thinking now, the huge country houses, it's a lot of money. More than this, you have to have a wonderful collection in the country houses as well, and the display of them as well is meant to show the wealth, taste, class, especially if you've got collections relating to the Grand Tour. And in the 18th century, there's a greater emphasis on accessibility and visiting country houses as well. There's also huge political power associated with the country house. By the 18th century, at least 80% of House of Commons members were also country house owners. So it's the kind of statistical evidence associated with the country house as well. But you didn't even need to spend that much time in the country house. So between November and June, that was the London season, making most of a person's year actually spent in London, not even in this lovely country house they've spent thousands of pounds on. But it's the fact you have the country house which is the exercise of power, not necessarily the traditional sense of living in it. So it's unsurprising that country houses are generally seen as being very male-centric spaces. Elite women are often discussed as pawns through which political alliances can be made, vessels through which wealth can be passed, and as mothers to carry on a husband's lineage. Recent kind of studies in the 18th century country houses have kind of touched on the working lives of women, specifically servants, and then obviously intellectual women in the 18th century, such as the Bluestockings, are still very well researched. But elite women and wives, specifically widows, are very much still kind of overlooked. So hopefully this can be a bit of a start into maybe exploring them a bit more. But in order to kind of understand how women, specifically widows, were able to kind of get a bit more power and agency in the country house, I think it's first necessary to kind of discuss the legal and economic position of these women at England at the time. And in order to understand her life and independence after her husband's death, it's first necessary to kind of appreciate the legal arena a woman entered when she married and signed what was essentially the most basic but most important document in her life, which was a marriage settlement. So most research places emphasis on fathers or family councils when it comes to finding partners for the children of the family. This very much overlooks the role of the mother or the family's matriarch, when in reality, most women took this task very seriously and were extremely successful. So a couple of examples here. Got Dame Alice Brownlow at Belton. She managed to secure a duke, two earls, and for 3 of her 5 daughters. Jane, Duchess of Gordon, she one-upped her and managed to obtain 3 dukes, a marquis and a baronet for hers. This was such an achievement, she actually had their titles engraved on her tombstone. Her daughter, Charlotte, Duchess of Richmond, she followed her mother's example when finding suitors for her own daughters. Frederick Colthorpe suggested that her trip to Dublin was to try and catch Frederick Lord Harvey, who was a son of the future first Marquis of Bristol, and that she had been endeavouring to entrap him during the last season. And although Harvey showed no penchant for her daughter, the Duchess, the true daughter of her mother, continues to persevere. But widows also were very important in finding suitors for their children. So Charlotte Grenville, who was the widowed Lady William's Wynne, she was greatly distressed when her son Charles refused to marry 2 of her choices, and she did not approve of his choice of Louise, who was the 13th daughter of the Lord Courtenay, who had very little money. She was overjoyed, though, when they came to the agreement on the wealthy Hester Smith, who was the daughter of the first Lord Carrington. But this kind of pushy mother stereotype, whether acting out of ambition or necessity, is also very well formed in literature of the period. One only has to think of Mrs. Hardcastle in Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer, Mrs. Malaprop in Sheridan's The Rivals, and of course, Mrs. Bennet in Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Now, once an attractive suitor was found, the deal was sealed through providing a good dowry, and this was also known as a substantial cash sum portion. Now, this went directly to the father of the groom, who would often transfer this into a dowry for one of his own daughters. And in return, he would guarantee the bride an annuity, also known as a jointure, in case his new daughter-in-law became a widow in the future. What this jointure consisted of did change over time, however. So prior to 1700, it was basically worked out on a system called thirds, which was either the value of a third of the value of the estates, or in some cases, the income of the estate. Now, sounds great at first, but it wasn't. So this is obviously subject to a variety of conditions well out of the widow's control, and it was also meant to provide provisions for any children that the family might have had. So really, there's not that much left over. But by 1700, so now looking at our period, this idea of thirds had gone out of fashion, and it was instead replaced with a fixed cash sum portion which directly related to the size of the dower portion, and it was negotiated on the point of marriage settlement between the two families. Now, this jointure was fixed, and whereas the early one, as I mentioned, was dependent on things that were outside of her control. But most importantly, this portion did not have to provide provisions for any children that the family could have. So it's very much just for her and her only, which very much kind of enables a degree of financial freedom for the widow after her husband's death. Final bit of context I want to go over is just the law quite quickly. So a woman would gain even further legal independence when she was a widow. So English law was quite remarkable at this point because it recognised single women, so these are women who never married, as well as widows, as legal individuals, which meant that there was no distinction in legal status between a man and a woman without a husband. Also, unlike the rest of Europe, English widows did not need to be represented legally by another male kinsman or something like that, for example, whereas in Europe they did. So at this point, a widow is now able to own property, make contracts, and be in control of her finances. Now, widows were in an especially good place if the husband had bequeathed personal or real property to her in his will, which she was now able to be in control of. Now she wasn't beholden by laws of coverture. Yeah, it was also very common for widows to be in control of the estates and property while the son was still, or son or heir was still a minor. So, for example, Sarah Osborne managed Chicksands Priory in Bedfordshire in her son's minority and left it in a much better state than it was before. And Charlotte Grenville, who we mentioned earlier, she was also entrusted by her husband to administer his estates in Wales while their son was still young. And she ran the estates from her husband's death in 1789 until transferring them to her son in 1819. She kept the finances intact, and she was also able to recall key financial details from memory and whether she should have the money in bills or stocks years later. So just to recap, in this situation, the widow has financial safety in her jointure, and in some cases is also now in control of estates left to her by her husband in his will, at least until the point where they were passing it to an heir if they had one. And given the number of widows who were entrusted with this responsibility, in between the husband's death and a son's coming of age, they would have had to be considered financially and legally savvy enough during the marriage to be able to be entrusted with this. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it meant that the 18th century saw a drop in remarriage, suggesting perhaps that maybe some of these women enjoyed this newfound financial and legal freedom. Now, there are so many examples I could have chosen for a specific case study for this, but I decided to go with Lady Leicester at Holcombe Hall in Norfolk. Here she is, and there's a lovely house. Now, she was called Margaret Tufton, Lady Clifford, Countess of Leicester, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we're just calling her Lady Leicester. And when she was left a widow, she was entrusted with the entire estate at Holcombe Hall. Now, Holcombe Hall was constructed between 1734 and 1764, and it is still regarded as one of the most important examples of a classical country house here in Britain. Now, the project was started by her husband, who was called Thomas Coke, and he was the first Earl of Leicester. And he started it with two architects, William Kent and Matthew Brettingham, who were two of the biggest country house architects. But sadly, in 1759, Coke passed away, and he left his entire estate to his dear wife to be used, occupied, held, and enjoyed during her life. Now, unlike the other widows we mentioned, there were no heirs to the estate. So sadly, Thomas and Margaret's only child and heir, their son Edward, had passed away in 1753. And as part of their marriage settlement in 1718, the couple were given Thanet House on Great Russell Street as their primary London residence. So as we said before, this is where they stay for most of the year. But in 1760, after Thomas Coke's death, Lady Leicester decided to sell Thanet House and undertook the enormous relocation to Holcombe Hall. Now, this is a momentous process. She had to relocate all the couple's possessions and extensive furniture collection in a period of intense grief and upheaval, making it hugely impressive, but I think it also demonstrates her administrative qualities to the project. It becomes even more impressive when it's remembered that Holcombe Hall was still largely a construction site when Lord Leicester passed away. So just for a bit of context, the Strangers' Wing, where the guests would stay, so a pretty important spot, that hadn't been fully completed. The portico room, the north side bedchamber apartment, the chapel and marble hall were all incomplete. The foundations of the stable hadn't even been dug, and all the wings were unfurnished. The fact she managed to complete all of that in 5 years, it's, I think, incredible, to be honest. She also proved all her contemporaries wrong. In 1759, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote her daughter describing how surprised she was at Lord Leicester's will, given Lady Leicester's real inability of managing it. Not great. But this is also kind of reflected in academia at the moment. Most research kind of surrounding country houses largely kind of overlooks women's or widows' contributions, but specifically Lady Leicester. A lot of historians kind of ignore her and instead talk about the architects involved, which is particularly surprising since one of Lady Leicester's first moves was the dismissal of Matthew Brettingham, who was the executant architect. And the earliest known plans of Holcombe date from 1726. They were drawn by Brettingham, annotated by Lord Leicester, kind of signifying how important Brettingham was to the project, how long he'd been working on it, and also how closely the two were working together. So his dismissal as soon as Lady Leicester kind of took over management of the project is a pretty bold and brutal move. And it kind of demonstrates that while she was going to follow her husband's plans, she was also going to do it in her own way, and I think suggests perhaps a new form of ownership over the project and the property. And she replaced Brettingham with a carver called James Miller. Now, this dismissal of a husband's choice of architect and the replacement with a lesser-known worker is somewhat of a trend within country house widows. So if we just go next slide. So Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, she fired her husband's favoured Sir John Vanbrugh in 1716 when she was working on Blenheim Palace, and replaced him with a cabinet maker called James Moore. And Anne Lady Irwin, when she was working on Temple Newsham, a property she famously loved, and she also had a very happy marriage, she rejected several famous and distinguished architects for the remodelling of this estate, and instead hired a local workman called William Johnson. Now, I think this could suggest a couple of things. Now, many of these husbands were notoriously spendthrift. Lord Leicester left Lady Leicester in more than £90,000 worth of debt, and the Duchess of Marlborough was always battling her husband over the kind of how much he consistently overspent in the early Blenheim Palace construction stages. So kind of being left in all this debt, and as well kind of being aware of how much you're going to have to spend on furnishings, it could just be that they wanted better value for money and so decided to go with the more local workman. But, you know, these women were not penniless and they also had their own private sources of money. So again, I think it kind of suggests a new form of ownership towards the project and a sense of independence as well. So if we go to the next slide. So just want to talk about a few spots in Holcombe Hall, which are my personal favourites. So this is Marble Hall. And this was an area of the house that Lord Leicester was especially eager to kind of get completed. But instead, it was Lady Leicester who oversaw the plasterwork, the carpentry, and the joinery until its completion in 1761. Now, in many ways, she carried out her husband's design plan using classical plaster casts purchased by Brettingham and adopting his Venetian windowed plans. She even uses the same staff this time. So in 1761, she makes a payment to Joseph Howell for moving the statues into the hall and working up the pedestals for them to stand on. And this is the same Joseph Howell who worked on her own bedroom dressing room, according to a letter from Lord Leicester in 1740. However, she doesn't entirely stay with the plan. So in 1761, she makes another payment to the architect James Miller to hire men to carve the pattern rail to go between the columns in the Great Hall, and another payment to carve reverse patterns of the rail in the Great Hall for the smith to work on, as well as a time frame to complete this on. Now the result is this lovely iron railing we see there, which does not match Kent's original drawings at all. Instead, he wants to include a conventional marble balustrade between the columns. So she's very much deviating from her husband's kind of plan and his own style as well. But this iron railing wasn't entirely Lady Leicester's idea. So if we just go to the next slide, they're an exact replica of Lady Isabella Finch's ironwork balustrade in her house in number 44 Berkeley Square. Now, this is interesting for several reasons. So Lady Finch's house was very fashionable and very well regarded. Horace Walpole, who was notorious for being a bit mean, he even liked them. And he said that they were as beautiful a piece of scenery and considering the space of art as can be imagined. So perhaps Lady Leicester was kind of concerned with balancing the Palladian and classical references of her husband's design with touches of modernity and fashion. It also demonstrates how important and influential visiting these kinds of houses was in the 18th century. Crucially, the ironwork in Lady Finch's home was also designed by Kent, meaning that while Lady Leicester had strayed from her husband's designs, no one could really accuse her of going too far because she was influenced by other work from one of her husband's architects. But crucially, Lady Finch was unmarried. So, as discussed, unmarried women and widows were treated very similarly in terms of the law, but also perhaps socially and culturally. meaning that in this way, Lady Leicester's inclusion of ironwork she may have seen at Lady Finch's home becomes almost an homage to the independence and architecture of another single woman's home. So if we go to the next slide, just in terms of a bit of interior design. So it was kind of similar, her approach to interior design, as it was to the architectural features. So the Stranger's Wing, which I mentioned, is where guests would stay. Hadn't even been decorated by the time of her husband's death. So this is, a crucial part of the house to really get right. And she paid for the very costly furnishings from her own private savings rather than the estate. The green damask bedchamber alone totaled £261.18, demonstrating her dedication to the project as well as her financial responsibility. It meant she was responsible for deciding where to display their extensive painting collection as well. So in the anteroom of the Stranger's Wing, this included 11 portraits of the Coke family, which were mainly by Andrea Casali and some by Sir Godfrey Kneller, and they were all commissioned by her late husband. And so her hanging these illustrious paintings of her husband's lineage in the wing where guests would stay was a very important decision because the celebration of family and lineage is integral to the essence of a country house and their survival. And so placing these portraits in a room where guests would not be able to miss them is a pretty important move. It's also important in terms of political motives, as unlike her own lineage, Lord Leicester's rise to nobility was very recent, meaning that there was a certain need to kind of establish and reinforce the fact that the couple could claim an illustrious descent, especially now that Lady Leicester was, very much alone, in order to give the country seat longevity and presence. Now, the final area I want to talk about, which is of interest architecturally, is the chapel. So, again, the construction of this space hadn't even been started by the time of her husband's death, but his plans had been approved. So, according to the original plans, her husband wanted Guido Reni's Assumption of the Virgin that he had bought placed behind the altar and flanked by one Corinthian column and one pilaster on either side. Now, classic Lady Leicester, she does slightly what he wants, but again does her own thing. So now if we go to the next one. Instead, she places his choice in the middle, but instead of the columns, she commissioned the contemporary and London-based artist Giovanni Battista Cipriani to paint St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music, and St. Anne, the patron saint of mothers, to flank Reni's painting, with this as the result. So her choosing female saints is a pretty bold move in itself and very much a departure from the usual country house altarpiece artwork, which usual choices being the Assumption, but also the Annunciation or scenes from the life of Jesus. It's very rare to see one, never mind two, depictions of female saints behind the altar, especially when it means, as a result, there's no men, not even Jesus is up there. It's a pretty important one. And so I think we can all kind of agree it creates a very feminine, divine, female-centric space, which is particularly interesting when it's situated within the country house and its grounds, which is something usually symbolic of and synonymous with patriarchal power and wealth. Her commissioning of the paintings also very much firmly fits her with the trend of aristocratic women as art patrons. And her choice of Cipriani is also significant. Instead of trying to find a painting by an old master, she instead chooses a contemporary artist. So I kind of think that just looking at the chapel alone is almost symbolic of her and other widows like her relationship with the country house and the construction and curation of it. They very much follow their late husband's plans, but when you look closely, you can see that there are ways in which these women created space and meaning, and perhaps through that, a sense of ownership. And I would argue it's all because the 18th century very much enabled this through the kind of law and economic situation that they were in. So that's all I've got to say. But if anyone's got any questions, I think, we've got time for that.
Well, first of all, thank you. That was fascinating. The whole road group. Very, very complex situations legally, economically, and socially to navigate there, and a whole world that I knew little about. So thank you for that. It's hugely
My pleasure.
I'd like to open to questions, and I'm sure there are many. Yeah.
If a woman remarried, would that alter her legal position?
Yeah, it means when she remarries, her property, which would include, I think, her husband's estate, her previous husband's estates, would then go to him and his family. So that's why you, to be honest, don't really want to remarry. Yeah. Or maybe they do. Maybe they do. Love. I don't know.
Are there any statistics on the number of remarriages versus?
There are, which I can't remember off the top of my head. If you drop me an email, I can send you some literature on it.
Layla, first of all, thanks. That's really fascinating. Well done. Obviously, this was in a period where country house visiting was getting more common and art criticism was kind of rising up. Did you come across anything about kind of contemporary views on this, let's call it kind of feminisation of the country house? Was there a reaction, negative, positive? Did it even get talked about?
It did get talked about, not in terms of so explicitly like why she put like 3 women behind the altar, but that's more, yeah. Lady Oxford at Welbeck Abbey was one that people really talked about. So Welbeck Abbey was, it came from her side of the family rather than her late husband's. And so as a result, she filled it with paintings of her own family. He was barely mentioned. He'd be kind of forgotten about and pushed to one side. And she remodeled it in the architecture, kind of, it's almost like late Tudor kind of style, because that's where her family lineage really starts. And people really commented on that. And they were very much like, oh, she's doing it because, you know, it's all about her family, her lineage. Her grandfather was really, like a really well-renowned horse rider, and so she had all the paintings of him, all his beloved horses, and then she had paintings commissioned of her with horses as well. So she was very much kind of connecting herself with the past, and that was an aspect that people really commented on, particularly Horace Walpole. He really liked it, of course, Horace. He really kind of celebrated that. Yeah, he really admired it. No, he wasn't negative. He really liked it, and that was kind of, yeah, everyone was really into it, but they all very much commented of, yeah, she's connecting herself with her family rather than her husband's. No, thank you.
Yeah, the legal position been changed since, say, Tudor times. You've got people like women like Safar,
Yeah.
who were serial
Yeah.
marriages, so increasing her own power at the time.
Yeah. Funny best of Hardwick actually. So Lady Oxford was her descendant. Just good little link. But I'll admit Tudor law isn't my speciality. But kind of 16th, 17th century, it was very much, like I said, they followed this thirds principle, which wasn't great for women. And they were very much left with actually really not much money. And if that estate was sold, they'd be kind of left essentially homeless and having to kind of depend on either her husband's family or, you know, if they had brothers, they could rely on them, which is why kind of very late 17th and then 18th century, it's much more kind of beneficial for them, and that's why they can do more of this kind of country house construction. Yeah.
Example of powerful, successful single women.
Yeah, well, Lady Isabella Finch was one, Berkeley Square. There was, the lady who, I've completely forgotten her name, made a townhouse in London. I've forgotten her name, it'll come back to me. I mean, I would say Hester Thrale was a successful, well, she got very married, but in her widowhood, she also was successful, and she built Brynbella as well, which is, you know, a wonderful bit of architecture. So yeah, there are other kind of successful single women. Yes.
Do you know who the drivers were, who were obviously men, behind the changing of the laws to benefit?
Oh my, that's a really good question. No, I don't. But yeah, exactly. No, I don't. There was, I don't know if this really answers it. They had to go through private acts of parliament quite a bit. So just, again, thinking of the thirds thing, if the thirds wasn't, if it wasn't the income of the estate, they'd have to get, what was it again, the value, that's scrambled me, that's a really good question. They'd have to go through kind of, if their landowner settlement meant they couldn't raise the value of the thirds, they had to go through a private act of parliament to get basically the equivalent. And that was the same with quite a few things. So I don't know if people just got kind of fed up and were like, okay, let's just change it a bit to get people to stop going through these private acts. But in terms of who was making the laws then, I don't know, I'm afraid. This is becoming a recurring answer. I don't know.
Yes, of course, 100 years later, you've got behind the Women's Property Act. So that would be all a male enlightened man. So there were a few of us around.
Oh, no. This is not a men bashing session. In Dr. Johnson's house, we would never do that. We love men.
And divorce would have a bearing on this.
Divorce would, yes. I don't know what the divorce rates were. I think a lot of women, like a lot of couples, kind of just stuck it out, really. I mean, to go back to one of the, Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, didn't really, like, they did not like each other particularly, and they were kind of constantly arguing. And I think, I don't want to say, oh, so-and-so didn't like their husband, but, because we don't know. But I wonder as well with Lady Oxford, just the fact she just did not put anything to do with the husband in this very expensive country house could suggest something. But so I think most people kind of just, like I said, stuck it out and then didn't remarry. Some widows did remarry, but yeah, there was a drop in remarriage. Okay.
If they changed to get a jointure, which was some of theirs, what happened to the female children? Did they have any sort of provision made by the father so they could have a dowry?
Yeah. Whereas in terms of what because the father's just died.
Yes.
If she's got her jointure.
She's got her.
Yeah.
The wife's got her jointure.
Yeah.
But how about the girls? Did they have any money put aside for their dowry?
I think there was kind of the trend to put some money aside, but there was kind of then more reliance on their own family who would kind of step in a bit more. But that's why it became really quite important that widows stepped in with sorting out, trying to find a husband for them, really. Yeah. It's still not great being a woman in the 18th century, but it was better than it had been, I would say.
Well, fantastic. Some really great questions too there, and well answered. But just to say, sort of express our thanks again for what you've said.